It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love, to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
Hey folks, I'm Chris Jager. Australia is a country with a reputation for loving sports. People form lifelong allegiances to the sports clubs they support and the sporting codes they follow. The hero worship of athletes and players is also commonplace. The mental health of professional, high-performance athletes is something that has historically fallen by the wayside. A 2020 survey of 749 athletes, supported by the Australian Institute of Sports, found that athletes were significantly more likely to report high to very high psychological distress compared to general community norms, and also were more likely to report symptoms of depression and anxiety at a level that would warrant professional healthcare. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Ranjit Menon to unpack what mental health looks like for high-performance athletes. Dr. Menon is a sports psychiatrist with a speciality in managing mood and anxiety disorders. He specialises in the management of psychiatric disorders in high-performance athletes. In 2019, Dr. Menon was appointed the inaugural Chief Psychiatrist for the AFL. Dr. Menon joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
What drew you to sports psychiatry?
It's an interesting question. I think it organically led me to that because, as you said, we are a sports-mad country, so to speak. But there was really no narrative around what happens for athletes from a mental health perspective. As a psychiatrist, I was curious about that because we used to have radio reports of a list of injuries that each club in the AFL had on every week. And that would be advertised broadly in terms of this is a person who's looking at 6 weeks off, and this person's got an ACL, looking at season off, that sort of stuff. But there was really no narrative around the mental health struggles. So it was either an assumption that somehow athletes didn't have mental health issues, or that if they did have mental health issues, we shouldn't talk about it. Both of those presumptions, in my opinion, are highly erroneous. That's what got me looking into this a decade ago. And I think my concerns were well-founded, as I found out as things kind of unraveled over the last decade. The emphasis on sport mental health has increased, not just in Australia, but around the world. And so we have to come up with better understanding, first of all, and then better interventions and highly specialized interventions in this particular cohort to get good results.
Why do you think it is that less attention has been paid to mental health in the sports field historically?
There are probably three aspects that I would say. First of all, I guess it's that highly kind of macho attitude that somehow sports in itself, you're bigger than life, and therefore trivial things like mental health issues are not going to bother you. You should be able to brush that aside. It was a sign of character and mental toughness and all of those things we've attributed to athletes, particularly in the type of sport we play here, which are really hard games, AFL and rugby and that sort of stuff, where there's a lot of physical contact. And so I think that's probably the culture that is set aside to saying that this was somehow not feasible in this area. The second is probably, I think there's a constant struggle in a sporting context between high performance sport or high performance environment and health. And I'm a big proponent of saying that mental health doesn't exist by itself. It's only a part of the overall health of the individual. And whenever it comes to this debate or contest between these aspects of health and performance, invariably, up until now, performance wins. So we give extra credits to somebody who completed the game with a broken leg or a broken whatever and managed to get through, and that's somehow seen as something good for them to do. We then don't hear about the fact that they retire with significant injuries after that, which never get better because it was ignored during that period of time. And this interface between performance and health really worries me, particularly when it comes to mental health, because of the stigma attached to that. At least in physical kind of injury, you can say I've been injured and I can demonstrate that. But if somebody becomes depressed or develops an anxiety disorder or develops post-traumatic stress disorder in the context of a sporting context, it's very hard for them to come up and say, look, I don't think I can actually turn up this weekend because I'm not well. So again, performance wins out. They're saying, well, we need you on the field, and you can't be a sissy and pull out at the stage. That shows weakness. And so you're almost put into this unviable position where you have to, in some way, because otherwise it would be embarrassing. It would be socially costing for them. And I suspect the third thing is athletes develop what we call athletic identity. That means as they grow up, they're seen as particularly gifted or particularly talented or particularly skilled. And they're kind of shaped into adopting that skill or that talent as their identity. For people who are non-athletes, we are allowed to kind of develop in a different way and develop our own temperament and our identity in a much more broad-based system. They bring with them this high demand, this high need to perform and succeed and showcase their skills. So I think there's a lot of expectation-based kind of anxiety already. And if that doesn't go forth or something kind of threatens that identity, let's say injury, where you are 18 years old, but you've suffered an ACL and you're not sure how long it'll take to recover, it can be devastating for an 18-year-old. So that anything that challenges or interrupts that athletic identity is something that's very confronting to athletes and increases the likelihood of mental health distress and mental health disorders from coming up. So I think these are things we understand so far. There may well be other factors that we have still to understand further.
Professional athletes as well, they're developed from such a young age. Do you think that the young age has something to do with the stigma that they face around mental health issues?
Most athletes are young people. There's an automatic kind of cohort of people who are young, who are still understanding how to work with the world and understand their strengths and where they kind of need to develop further. So it's an exploration time for them. And it's unfortunately, it's at the same time where this demand of performing in sport comes onto them. So I think obviously that does create challenges. I think that's probably why sporting codes have set standards in terms of how old you need to be able to be recruited or drafted into a club, because we are trying to allow that period of time for maturation to develop before they can actually come into this high performance environment. There are probably three reasons why mental health disorders could potentially come up in athletes. The first is some people bring with them their genetic attributes. So they may have a family history of psychiatric disorders. They may have come up in an environment which has been abusive or difficult or challenging, which develops certain types of increased risk to mental health disorders. So they bring with them the risk of developing vulnerabilities or disorders themselves. The second group of people become mentally ill or mentally distressed as a result of the specific sports setup, which is this expectation, athletic identity, stigma within sport, injury periods of time, all of that, and high performance environment. In some people, that environment really causes them to display symptoms, even if they didn't previously have psychiatric morbidity or previously had any significant vulnerability. Just being in that environment for a period of time increases their own risks of expressing a mental health issue. The third is probably cultural. There are certain cultures that exist within certain codes of sport, which potentially make things more difficult for some people who come in. One of the examples could be around a particular use of alcohol. In many sport, at least up till the last few years, it was considered to be normal to finish a game and go and become intoxicated on that. And if you set up an example like that for a young person coming in, if that's the culture of that particular club, then obviously they're going to be tempted to kind of take part in that, which increases their risk as well. So I consider that those three domains as the reasons why there could be an increased expression in this particular cohort. Up until probably 5 years ago, there wasn't really a system by which they could gain care. And that care is highly specialized to them. So I think what we've done over the last few years, myself and colleagues of mine who work in sports psychiatry, we're trying to put together some sort of end specialized kind of treatment program or management plan that specifically caters to athletes.
That stigma you were talking about before, like what do you think is the best way to lessen the entrenched stigmas that you were mentioning that are in certain sporting codes?
I think many organizations are primarily looking at culture change. And I guess that acceptance that we're all vulnerable and that it's not a moral failure, that development of a psychiatric disorder is not some sort of moral failure. It's just like any other chronic physical disorder like diabetes or asthma or hypertension. It can happen to vulnerable individuals in vulnerable situations, and that there's good management strategies around, and there's no need to see people in that stigma kind of lens. I think that's culture change is occurring quite broadly societally, as well as within sporting organizations as well. Many of the other steps to reduce kind of racial prejudice, to reduce kind of gender prejudice, etc., will also lead to some attenuation in these potential mental health stigma statistics. But lastly, I think we've had, and specifically taking Australia, I mean, this has been something that's done around the world. So places like Canada, places like the US, many of the Western countries have largely accepted the societal base for mental health, mental illness, so to speak. And that the stigma, I think, is actually better than it was in the past. It's nowhere near where it should be, but it's certainly moved a long way from where it used to be. In order to directly combat stigma, I think the most important thing is being able to speak openly and freely about this. There is still stigma being perpetuated because even people with mental health disorders somehow don't want to talk about it, causing what we call self-stigma. That they're afraid of the consequences, or they're ashamed of the consequences. And we hold it at a different kind of being. So privacy, for example, we don't have as much privacy in terms of physical statistics as much as we have of mental health. It's going to consider to be this dirty secret that we shouldn't talk about. And I think that actually accentuates stigma rather than reduce it. So I think we should be able to talk freely, openly, challenge some of the concepts around mental illness, demonstrate that it can actually be managed quite well. And I think that's probably where it starts.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right when you were talking about the self-stigma. I think sometimes going through mental health distress, you pick up on the stigmas that are in society, and then you internalize it yourself.
Exactly right. And that happens in a sporting context as well.
What are the different pressures faced by male and female athletes, and sort of how do these pressures differ? I know, for example, there's a big pay gap between professional female athletes and professional male athletes.
So there's not a lot of data that I can actually say specifically in terms of us understanding, at least from a psychiatry perspective, what that difference looks like. The manifestation of disorders probably is equitable to what we would see in community. Overall, I'd say that I haven't found any significant differences in terms of presentation. Of course, in terms of diagnoses between male and female athletes. In terms of presentation, however, there's a couple of points to make, is that we've got some evidence that athletes actually present differently when they become unwell with mental illness, as opposed to people that I treat non-athletes as well. And as opposed to them, I think athletes kind of probably present mostly with slightly different complaints. So rather than actually talking about her feeling sad or feeling depressed or feeling low, it usually comes about as losing interest in their training or losing interest in their particular sport and not having that enjoyment even after a win. And that kind of stuff is what we hear about. So it sends off flags to me when I hear that coming from an athlete. And to me, that's more representative that there's something going on for them than them coming and telling me about they're feeling low. So I think having that real sense of listening to what is actually coming through from these people when they're struggling, and having a broad construct behind in terms of learning how to actually place that, I think that helps us understand what's actually going through for them.
Knowing the signs to look out for in athletes, and it mightn't necessarily be somebody verbalizing that they're struggling.
Exactly right. I mean, in sporting clubs, I mean, we've got club doctors in most kind of setups who are quite well trained in musculoskeletal injuries and general physical health of people. Some of them are quite well trained in mental health aspects of it. They are GPs who've got wide experience in seeing people with psychiatric disorders, but their emphasis has always probably been taken away in terms of fixing the musculoskeletal stuff. That's what they have time for. So by default, it's a psychologist within clubs who would probably then kind of be given the responsibility of screening people and saying who's struggling. But I think it should extend much beyond that. I do strongly feel that everybody has a role to play in terms of supporting each other within that sort of construct and picking up when people are not coming through as being them. So the kind of, are you doing okay kind of stuff. But it's probably shouldn't stop at a question. They should be trained in being able to respond to the next step, which is, what do I do now? If they say I'm not okay, well, then what do I do now? I don't know what to do. They should have channels where they can then take those concerns to kind of people who are professional and say, look, I'm worried about this individual because of so and so. I just thought I'll mention that. We probably should touch base with them. And also learning where not to get involved in, because that can potentially increase risks and cause other difficulties. So I think we need to have this broad-based structure about recognizing when someone's distressed or somebody's unwell, And then also knowing what's the next best step to do in terms of getting that person medical attention.
And I guess, like, I know sports people have a pretty short lifespan to their careers. How do they handle that sort of post-retirement and post being really well known for performing in a particular sporting code?
It's a really important point you raised. I think we don't have metrics in terms of exactly what numbers. However, it's quite short, right? It's your performing years, unless you're in certain types of sport where endurance is really good. You can kind of perform for 20 years, and equestrian jumping and things like that, where sometimes they've got a high longevity of career in that. But most sport, it's about 4 or 5 years. And I think you spend an exorbitant amount of time of your younger years, till about the age of 18 or 20, getting ready for those 4 or 5 years. And then you've got this burst of 4 or 5 years where you actually perform, and then there's no idea what you do after that. So I guess in the past, it wasn't something that we gave a lot of attention to socially in terms of what happens to athletes after they retire. The expectation was, oh, they've made a ton of money, so they'll be fine. But most people don't. It's only the really, really successful 5% or so who've kind of made good choices, made good investments, and earned a lot of money over that period of time, or played a sport where there's a high reward. There are many sports where the reward is actually quite small. And so in professional sport, what we need to do is challenge this athletic identity and actually ask people when they're younger to say, you need to have some plans post-retirement in terms of what would you like to do. So education, basic life kind of skills in terms of banking, in terms of simple things, and having a trade or a profession to follow after that. And to the credit, many sporting organizations are doing that now in terms of using PDMs, player development managers, and people like that, in order to kind of make sure that athletes are enrolled or connected to some kind of training program so that they've got some clear trade or profession once they finish. But the difficulty here is we don't know when they're going to finish. All it takes is one catastrophic injury or a season that's out of form where they get dropped or they get traded or delisted. So there's so many unknowns. And I think what we know is that life with unknowns increases anxiety. So that's another thing that causes this distress in terms of, I'm injured right now, I'm not sure whether I'll come back. I think education is a really important part of that, to say that, yes, this is all going to end at some point in time, but it's about having fun while it exists and trying the best you can. So it's, again, getting that balance right. We do a lot of that when we manage athletes in terms of giving them the appropriate set of expectations for themselves and recalibrating that.
And is it also about forging an identity for athletes, even when they are at the top of their game, forging an identity outside of the sport that they play?
Absolutely. I think, and most good high performance athletes or professional already know that and do that quite well in terms of, and this can be social kind of constructs about having a family, which is a really important thing. It can be about having finances which are protected rather than kind of gambling it away or getting into deals with kind of shady people who, and then losing their money. So it's all of this stuff. And I think it's a learning process, just like anything else. But I think there is a role for specialized people like financial advisors, like training institutes, like trade kind of institutes, all of these, to actually have positions available for high performance athletes by connecting through the clubs to see if they can be promoted and assisted to developing this alternate identity, so to speak, or a balancing of identity, so to speak, in terms of what they do once they finish their athletic career.
That's so true. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. It's been enlightening.
My pleasure, Chris, and thank you for having me. And all the best to your program. And we'll touch base at some other time.
Hey guys, welcome to the section of the show called Club Mind, where we have 3 participants reflect on the interview we just heard, which today was with Dr. Ranjit Menon, who is a sports psychiatrist, and chatted with Chris about mental health in sports. I'm Caroline Sabransky. This Club Mind, I'm joined with Patrick, Jane, and Bree. Thanks for coming on today, guys.
Very welcome. Hello.
Thank you, Caroline.
So Dr. Menon spoke about the quote-unquote macho-ness and mental health toughness in sports. What do you think about that mentality in sports?
I do believe it's incredibly outdated. And it does relate to sort of, I guess, general life in Oz, and particularly for males in very masked sports such as league, union, and such. It can be a very sort of locker room mentality. It's not seen as normal, I guess, to be vulnerable, openly vulnerable, and talk about your feelings and your mental health. But in saying that, I do think that at the moment, society as a whole is becoming more progressive, and mental health awareness is coming to the forefront. And the first thing I kind of thought of when I heard that is Married at First Sight, because Jake was a CEO. He, I think he started a company called Out of the Locker Room, which very much focused on that idea of like sport being way too masked and not being able to present your feelings to like, you know, a male dominated sport. So yeah, it's interesting.
And mask means masculine,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
for our older
Sorry about
listeners. Nah, it's all good, Patrick.
I think sport and mental health, for me, go hand in hand. The happy endorphins that you get from sport really help your mental health. And I think the macho image is dying out. The psychiatrist that was on the interview, he was with the AFL, and that's largely dealing with men, although there is the AFL women's competition coming up. I just think sport is a really interesting forum for discussing mental health, because we put those people up on a pedestal, and I think we're more forgiving of them, that they're coming out and saying, you know, I've got a problem, and I think it's helping break down the barriers.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think, Bree?
Yeah, definitely can agree that there's previously been this like real focus on a macho attitude and like being tough in sport, and like a lot of validation around that in most sports. And yeah, just a real focus on this tough character, and also the behavior like off the field as well, being quite macho and not really delving into emotional and mental health. But as Patrick mentioned, like there is a shift happening, and definitely becoming more in the public discussion.
So we spoke about like an on-field and off-field persona that comes with being an elite athlete. And part of the on-field persona or expectations is you push through the injuries no matter the outcome. And as a society, a lot of us are coming around to the idea of self-care. And I kind of think like it would be great if pro athletes could engage in the kind of self-care that everybody else does. But I'm thinking, are any of you guys sports fans? And how would you feel if one of your favorite athletes couldn't join a game? Do you feel like there is room for self-care in elite sports?
I think that it's as an athlete and as a sporting team, that focus, it's really come into the limelight as a spectator, seeing, say, for example, I'm a big fan of the NBA, and it's quite often players will rest throughout the regular season so that they're, you know, prepared mentally and physically for the finals. As a fan and a paying spectator, it's kind of, I guess, annoying to a lot to see some of their favorite players sit out for whatever health reasons. But I mean, yeah, as a franchise, it's something that they're all looking at and that they're all doing and utilizing. And I think it's really great benefit for the players that are able to do that. Yeah.
I don't think there is room for self-care in elite sport, because of the time frame that the psychiatrist was saying. The burst of years that are productive for that athlete are narrow, 4 to 5 years. So, you know, for self-care, I think it's a lifelong thing. And I don't think there's room for it.
Yeah, there has been some recent examples of this in the sporting world, like in the recent Olympics, Simone Biles had to pull out of the gymnastics. She's in the American gymnastics team for mental health, and like Naomi Osaka in the tennis. So I think people are maybe feeling a bit more comfortable stepping back and focusing on mental health. And it's really good to see that. But I guess there's still backlash, and they still feel like really guilty for doing that. So I think maybe those sort of pioneers will be able to lay a bit of a, pathway for people to be able to step back if they need to. And it's so important in like high performance like activities to be like mentally okay, because it's so easy to make mistakes and really hurt yourself. And as they mentioned in the interview, like that could be for life. So it's not just during your career, you could be really injured for life.
Yeah, and the span of the career or the peak of the career is already so short, and that's for many sports. That's what we're expecting, a short lifespan for the career. So imagine an athlete gets very badly injured and their career becomes even shorter, and they're aware of that, but they're still getting pushed to play the game because people are depending on them. I mean, I know, Jane, you said there's no time for self-care in elite sports. Do you think that's something that, as fans of sports, we could help change?
Yes, I do. I think support for our athletes is very important, and acceptance of mental health in the field of sport. But just in general, in society, I think there's still a lot of stigma about mental health. And I don't think people really understand mental health unless they've had it in their family or a friend. So, yes, I think we can help our athletes by supporting them. But I still maintain that it's a short time frame that they've got to perform, and self-care is very difficult.
Yeah, and it definitely touches on, I guess, spectators' own priorities against the athletes. So, like, I know I've referenced the NBA already, but like, I remember in the finals a few years back, I think it was Kevin Durant. He had a really serious sort of ACL injury, but he was such a primary point of the team. And he was almost forcefully came back. He had to forcefully come back a little bit prematurely, and in so had like re-injured his ankle. And I think that spectators of the sport forget the importance, of athlete health, and it's more focused on whether or not their team's going to win. So no, it's definitely a conversation at the moment for sure.
I think it's becoming more accepting in AFL in recent years about mental health. Now, one of the Essendon players has been off with mental health issues, and that seemed to be rather accepted, even in the way the media portrayed it. Whereas if you go back 5 years, if someone suggested mental health, everyone would go, ooh.
So Dr. Menon briefly touched on the culture of sports in society, knocking off a game and then going out having big drinks and partying and things like that. He didn't discuss too much about it, but I feel like in Australian sports culture, that's a big thing. Like, we expect, boys to be boys and for them to party and for them to get into mischief and things like that. How do you think somebody struggling with their mental health in that kind of culture, how do you think they'd cope?
Yeah, it would depend, I guess, on, their mental state and stuff like that. But being around sort of drugs and alcohol with a mental health issue, obviously, might not be the best environment for them. So, like, to have such encouragement, from the team and their expected involvement, I don't think it would be great at all, to be honest, for their mental health. Yeah, you see it a lot, especially like when you're at the top and you have so many yes men around you. So, you're pretty well off financially, have drugs and alcohol readily available. At the end of the day, the only thing stopping you is you. So when you have such encouragement, like, it's pretty hard wormhole to get out of. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely that peer pressure aspect of like you're part of the club now, you have to, be involved in all activities, even post-game. And if you were struggling, you would probably just feel like you have to go with it in order to get that acceptance and feel part of the team.
Mm. Yeah. With mental health medication, a lot of times it's recommended that you don't take alcohol. And I think that would be very much a pressure to be almost forced into that kind of drinking and drugs and, and the person's already got a lot of things to deal with. I just think it's a big pressure.
Yeah, you're right. On a lot of mental health medications, it's definitely recommended not to drink, let alone do drugs. Also, on a lot of mental health medications, there are side effects like fatigue or weight gain. And generally, if you have a diagnosis of mental health, sometimes you can be fatigued and have other physical health issues. Do you feel like there's any room for that in sports? If somebody has gone on a medication and is feeling lethargic and is struggling with their weight a little bit, do you feel like the sports community would accept that?
I don't think there's time to accept that, because a weight gain problem could affect your performance. And therefore the person would, the athlete may feel that they're not good enough and they might drop out.
Yeah, I think there's so much pressure on like personal accomplishment, personal success, that person would feel very isolated and maybe disconnected because, there's all this pressure to be the best and do their best and they can't achieve that. So that would just be fueling that cycle of mental health like issues.
Obviously, being part of that team and having that contract in place, fans of said team are going to have expectations of you as a player. So obviously they're going to be less understanding for you if they see that you've put on weight or you're missing games and stuff like that. It's just kind of like there are so many armchair experts out there that are, questioning why you're doing those things and just have no awareness or understanding as to what you're going through.
Yeah, the contract, Patrick.
The contracts, yeah.
The bloody contract.
It'll get you.
Most people who are employed, they've got to answer to their managers, maybe their executives. But as an athlete, you're answering maybe not necessarily to a whole country, but to all the fans of your team. How much pressure do you think that puts someone under to have such a huge amount of people to answer to for your performance?
Oh, like incredible amounts. It even just transcends sports. So like when you're at such a high level and you're on Twitter, you're on social media, it's almost as if like your opinions on things outside of sports, your political opinions, your opinions on, issues in the world, you need to tread carefully with how you respond to that. And I'd imagine it'd be just really frustrating, having to have your thing, like your opinion filtered, or you can't voice yourself, because in effect you could have essentially offend your fan base or your franchise.
It's like walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
In every aspect. You're accountable to yourself, your team, your spectators, your sponsors. I mean, sponsors are not going to look kindly on someone who's putting on weight or missing games because there's money involved. And when there's money involved, that also puts on a lot of pressure.
Yeah, I feel like you'd already be having all this intrinsic pressure, like pressuring yourself. And then you'd also have all that external pressure and not knowing if you have a contract next year, like if your contract's running out and trying to renew contracts. I think it would be a constant pressure and like very stressful. And for someone who did have a predisposition to mental health, like that could really be quite devastating for that person.
Yeah.
So many athletes are so young, and Dr. Menon spoke about having sort of standards of how old a person can be before they can go into elite sports. But I think 21 is the average age for like NRL, AFL before you're a sports athlete. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But that is still so young, and their life is incredibly public. Like you said, Patrick, they're on social media, they're on Instagram. All their thoughts, all their opinions, all the photos are posted. And any slip up, that's there for life. Thanks so much for joining us on Club Mind today. We just spoke to Patrick, Jane, and Bree, who shared their opinions on an interview with Dr. Ranjit Menon, who is a sports psychiatrist, and discussed mental health in sports. Thanks, guys, and see you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you.
Hi there, folks. My name's Chris Jager. In today's episode of Out of the Box, we're going to be talking to Darren Wagner. Darren's a peer support worker, peer educator, and former police officer with a lived experience of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Darren worked with mass trauma after supporting his community of Sandy Hook in the United States in the aftermath of the deadliest mass shooting at an elementary school in US history. Darren now lives in Sydney, and he joins us on Out of the Box to talk about post-traumatic growth. Thank you so much for joining us, Darren.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chris.
To kick us off, how long was Sandy Hook home to you and your family?
After I had been you'd mentioned, I'd been a police officer for about 15 years. And that was, I think, some of my earliest traumas. Eventually, as a way of kind of avoidance, I met somebody who happened to live in Australia. And she convinced me, hey, come out to Australia. And in classic avoidance, I went, this is about as far away from America as I can get. And moved here and had 2 sons. And we had a great life here. But it was shortly, probably around in 2006, that we had decided to move back, kind of ironically, so my sons could kind of have an American experience and kind of understand where I came from. And sadly, it was, too much of an American experience.
How would you describe the community of Sandy Hook, before the shooting happened?
Yeah, look, that's what drew us to it because, my wife had chosen it and we'd never actually lived there. We were looking for someplace similar to where we were at up in the Whitsundays, small community, close to a big city, but still semi-rural. So we were about 45 minutes, an hour away from New York City, but still in a very quintessential New England community. Just picturesque, small town America in its truest sense. Everybody knew everybody. The school was, so it was just that ironic, that place that you would say that it's absolutely the last place in the world that something such as a school shooting should happen.
Once the shooting had happened, shortly after, you started documenting and photographing Sandy Hook. What compelled you to do this?
Yeah, well, because I'd wanted to get away from that. I guess foolishly and very naively, I thought, well, if I wasn't a police officer, then I would be, immune from trauma. And so I took up photography as a very interested in visual arts. And prior to the shooting, I had been the school photographer documenting plays and just the best of the community. So on the day of the shooting, again, I consider myself very fortunate because my children, although they were affected, at the end of that day, they came home. For me, it was, shortly after it's like I had noticed that there was a large media presence, but they were really documenting the negative, the worst of what we had seen. So I told my wife, I said, look, for my family, for some of my friends and stuff, there was some really beautiful tributes being placed around the town. I thought, well, I'll just kind of capture some of the things that a lot of my friends and family, probably wouldn't be able to go out and see because they were in their own grief and loss state.
And I guess, is that the power of someone like you, like a local resident, rather than, out-of-state media documenting the town in the aftermath of such a tragedy?
Yeah, look, I mean, of course I had a very unique perspective. It was extremely challenging because it was extremely confronting because the entire world, there was just an outpouring. So, there was warehouses of candles and cards and teddy bears and thousands upon thousands of candles, handwritten cards, stapled every imaginable surface in the community. So it was just something that I felt that I needed as a visual artist for my own healing to kind of document, what I saw. And to me, most of what I had captured that day still has never seen the light of day.
Are there plans to have those photos see the light of day, or is it something that you've done just for you?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we'll be approaching the 10-year anniversary. At some point, I guess it's kind of like any kind of lived experience. At a certain point, it's okay to go back and have a peek.
Yeah, obviously doing that in a way where you're aware of your own sensitivities and, aware of things that could trigger off some mental distress.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's definitely something that, I want to look back on and go, I was part of something that, affected me for the rest of my life, for my family, my children. the community. It rippled out across the world, but it's like any trauma, eventually the world moved on.
And I guess, but when you were documenting Sandy Hook in the aftermath of the shooting, what was it that stood out to you?
I think when you're a graphic, when you've got an eye for photography, I think it was just everything. There was so many personal, people donated statues, cards placed everywhere. It was just overwhelming, the amount of people. And I think that's when I started to really realize that as much as people wanted to help our community heal, was the fact that they needed to actually do something. Their pain around the shooting, the way for them to process it was to put the words or the pictures or to make something. There was schools in Florida that would make cards and pottery and with the victims' names on it and ship it as their way of processing it. So I came to really realize how important the arts are, when it comes to healing.
The arts are definitely really important in communicating and healing, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was really fortunate because as a photographer, I had documented a lot of the arts, so the school plays and the dance schools, because we were so close to New York that most of the kids wanted to be on Broadway. So we had a lot of really talented kids. A lot of their parents were composers, and a lot of the people had ties to the theater community and arts community in New York City. And it was probably a few weeks afterwards that I had some members of the Broadway community reach out to our town, and they actually wanted to do a performance for us. So we agreed to do a one-night show where we had over 600 Broadway actors, producers, stage, makeup, sound, 600 people of the best, the top of Broadway, just to send it upon our town. And we didn't even have a theater big enough, so we had to go to the next town over to borrow their theater to put on a one-night spectacular show for the community. And the thing that I realized, even with those artists, it's like, and they literally said, we have to do something. The Sesame Street game for the show. So to have people that I grew up with on TV, people that taught me the alphabet, Bob and Big Bird, and to work with these people on stage was just, and it was overwhelming. I actually started to cry when the director introduced me to the cast. I said, I know these people. I grew up with them, and I just burst into tears. I was very, the tears just started to go, and the next thing I felt was this big soft paw on my face. And I turned around, here's this big blue paw, just kind of wiping the tears from my face, and it was Cookie Monster saying, "It's okay, Darren. It'll be okay." I'm like, oh wow, yeah. How life, within a month can be so tragic and so beautiful in the same space was just a phenomenal experience. Trying to find beauty, and I like how you'd mentioned the post-traumatic growth, because if anyone had ever said that I would grow from that experience, I would have said no. I would prefer not to grow. I'd prefer to be the same or even go backwards, because however over the many years after that and all the people that I've gotten to sit with who've experienced very similar traumas and just really horrific things. I've just been so fortunate to sit with people that are willing to share some of their stories, so that growth I know is possible, and finding the beauty. The beauty is there.
And I guess in terms of your mental health, like how was it affected by the shooting and the aftermath of the shooting?
Initially, I didn't think anything about it because you're just numb. I don't even remember the first day after my kids got home. I could tell you that's still a blank to this day. And so there was a numbness for weeks. I don't think I laughed probably for a good year and a half. I remember it was probably about a year and a half when I happened to be out at a cafe, and someone said something, and I cracked a smile. I didn't even laugh, but it just that smile was actually painful. I think the smile muscles had atrophied. I went, wow, that's interesting. I don't think I've smiled in well over a year and a half.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of recovery, like what does recovery from complex trauma, and I guess what does post-traumatic growth look like for you?
So for me, growth has been, I didn't see it in myself for a long time. I think I saw it in others first. So again, some really amazing because I started finding myself supporting other communities that had school shootings and other mass shootings. So I started going to a lot of pretty horrific events just to sit with people. But then when I saw how they were processing it and creating foundations in their child's honor, saying, hey, we're going to change the legislation. That it was such an inspiration to see people that had been through such horrors really doing something positive. But it took me a while to see it in myself, that I've actually grown through the experience. But I think more importantly is sitting with others that have been in similar things, that have processed it. We honor what that experience was, but then what they've done with that energy of the horrors, or the frustrations, or the anger of how they've been, what happened to them, and they've gone to make a better place. I was inspired just after hearing their stories that they got out of bed, let alone create foundations and create movements which are going to help make the world a better place.
How did you become involved in peer work?
So that's great. So I had tried to change the world myself because I couldn't live in a world where there was access to such weapons. So I tried to change the world through legislation and stuff. Tried to change the gun laws in America foolishly, and it was quite the battle. And I realized that this just wasn't my calling. And kind of as a family, we decided it was maybe time to move back to Australia and change our lives. So I think it was sitting with all of the other people that I had the great honor of sitting with, that I became very curious about psychology. What happens to people when they, what happens to the brain? I know my brain changed. I felt it. So I thought, well, I seem to find myself, no matter how hard I try, sitting with people that had hard experiences and things. So I took I decided to take a course in counseling. So that's, I found myself as an accidental counselor. Maybe it would be good to kind of upskill in that space. So I started by doing a certificate, and further encouragement was to do a diploma, and then further studies. Started doing some volunteer work. Like all of us, eventually going to start paying the bills. So I started plugging in mental health jobs, and came across this thing that said, here's and actually had never heard of that term before. Had never been offered it when I was in hospital on many occasions. Really wish that it had been a thing. In my early hospitalization, thought I know that changed my course early on. But when I saw the ad, I thought, well, this is just this has been written specifically for me. I mean, to have had a challenge with your health and willing to sit with other people, I thought, well, this can't be a real job. So started doing research, put in an application. And, so the past 6 years, I've been working with NGOs. I've now transitioned over to the government sector. And then for the past year, I've been a peer support manager. So starting to really know the space.
Yeah, I'm new to the space in terms of I started working there in March this year, and I'm finding it such a beautiful space, and there's so much room to grow and to make change.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think growing is, like you said, it's a young workforce, but there's so much growth in this sector right now. So the peer workforce, that mental health space is just growing. Often, sadly, again, because we're all experiencing a shared trauma around this pandemic, and I think the peer work is well placed, at least in my local health district. Peer work is so valued, so we're having all of these new initiatives around towards zero suicide, alternative to ED for people presenting to ED with mental health problems.
Yeah.
We know that often the emergency room isn't the best place for someone that's had health stress.
Yeah, that can be traumatizing in itself.
Oh, often, most often. So there are so many initiatives. The peer workforce is growing, 40, 50% in some areas. And not in a tokenistic way, but a really well valued. So this whole, valuing of lived experience, I think we're finally really coming alive. Honoring that we've had some pioneers, some peers that have really had, I know that it would have been extreme. I couldn't imagine how hard it would have been to have been a peer worker in the early days, trying to prove, that we're more than just that lived experience. Yes, that lived experience is an amazing lens, but a lot of us have different professional backgrounds, a lot of professional lived experiences that we bring into that space.
And what do you find that peer work gives back to you?
So that reciprocity, is and I'm usually I'm very honest with people that I sit with. It's like, I'm getting, I'm probably getting more out of it than they are. That's what keeps me coming back is, I can see that they're enjoying the talks and to be heard and just to be listened to.
That holding space and listening to people is so powerful.
So powerful. I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've realized, and especially when we're talking about these traumatic events and stuff. It's like there's no way, and you're starting to see peer workers here recently in Australia, because over the past 18 months, the multidisciplinary teams that I've worked with, just in the past 18 months, we've had one of the mental health teams that I've worked with. Went out and did a debriefing of the cruise ship that had returned from New Zealand around the volcano, and a lot of the tourists returned back. So we did mental health debriefing of the cruise ship around a volcano. We went into the drought, and then we went into the fires. Then we went into a pandemic. The beginning of this year, the pandemic continues along with floods. So we know that trauma is all around us.
Yeah, there's like personal trauma and then also, universal or worldwide trauma.
Yeah, universal. It's to be able to hold that space. There's nothing that I can say. There's nothing that I can offer as far as wisdom. But being able to hold that space is really what we do well.
Yeah. No, I think absolutely it's something that we do really well. And I understand you're working on a PhD proposal at the moment called the Phoenix Project. Can you tell me a bit more about that and how that sort of intersects with your peer work and your work in the trauma space?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it just sounds funny when anyone says that there's a PhD project. I think last year I started to feel a bit like a typical imposter or fraud because I actually never graduated high school. So to imagine doing a PhD, but I think because I've been in the space now long enough, I completed my master. I didn't graduate high school, but I did graduate. I did finish my master's last year, and I just started a second master's in preparation for the PhD. So the Phoenix Project is it's just kind of my way of kind of honoring the stuff that I've been through, so kind of linking into the Sandy Hook, all of the violence and all of the traumas that I experienced as a police officer, all of the people that I've sat with who I kind of refer to it as when I sit with somebody, they hand me this golden thread when they share something. So I've sat with so many people now. I'm left kind of at this stage of my life with a lot of golden threads. So what am I going to do with it? So I've decided to try to weave it into something meaningful. So I started to see the power of theater, drama around mental health, social injustice. So I piloted a program about 2 years ago. And it wasn't really about teaching people how to be actors, but just a lot of the skills actors use, they're just life skills. And we do it anyway. If you don't feel well, you get up, you get out of bed, and someone says, "How are you?" And you put on that mask.
You say fine.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm great. Knowing that behind that mask. So I think people that definitely are challenged mentally with any kind of concerns, and we all at times have to use some acting skills. So it's a fun way to explore being somebody else for a little while. How do you find your voice? How do you stand up?
Oh, that sounds like an incredible project, and thanks so much for your time this evening. I really appreciate it.
It's been wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast on community radio station 2RRR in Sydney. Produced by Leon Fernandez,
Caroline Savransky,
Chris Jager with executive producer Jeff Furlow. You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au. See you on the flip side, June bugs.